The deed was dated April the 12th, 1876. It was written in the careful slanting hand of a county clerk who had long since gone to his grave, and it described the property in the dry, emotionless language of the law. 160 acres of elevated plateau situated in the county of Redemption territory of Colorado. Bounded to the north by the ridgeline of Settlers Pass, to the south by the descent into the valley proper, to the east and west by nothing of particular consequence. To the men who gathered in the town hall on a cold December evening in 1878 to discuss its future, the land was known by a simpler name, the Anvil. It was a broad, flat-topped mesa of sun-scorched limestone, an ancient sandstone that rose above the fertile valley like a clenched fist raised against the sky. From below, it looked exactly like what its name suggested, a massive, immovable block of stone, hammered smooth by a million years of wind and weather. A place where nothing grew but scrub brush and wind-twisted junipers, whose roots clawed at the rock like skeletal fingers searching for something that was not there. It was considered by every measure of practical wisdom to be utterly and completely worthless. A geological afterthought, useful only for catching the harshest rays of the summer sun and funneling hot, dry winds down into the greenlands below. Ranchers used it as a landmark and nothing more. Children were warned away from its steep trails. And in the collective memory of the town of Redemption, no one could recall a single acre of the Anvil ever producing anything of value. Not a bushel of wheat, not a head of cattle, not a drop of water. This worthless monument of rock now belonged to Agnes Wardwell. She was 62 years old, a widow of 14 months, a retired school teacher who had spent 31 years standing before children in a one-room schoolhouse, explaining the difference between limestone and shale, between an aquifer and a well, between what the earth showed on its surface and what it kept hidden in its depths. Those lessons had not come from any textbook. They had come from her husband. Ezra Wardwell had been dead for just over a year now, taken by a slow and merciless pneumonia that had hollowed him out over the course of a single bitter winter. He had been 70 when he died, a tall, quiet man, with ink-stained fingers and a peculiar habit of pressing his ear against bare rock as if he expected it to whisper something back. And perhaps it had. For Ezra Wardwell had spent the better part of 4 decades studying the Anvil. He had purchased it for a pittance in 1851 when the land was so cheap that the territory practically gave it away. Other men had laughed at him then, just as they would laugh at his wife now. They had taken the good land, the river-bottom acreage with its rich black soil and easy access to water. Ezra had taken the rock. He had walked every inch of it. He had chipped at its edges with a geologist's hammer. He had mapped its layers with a precision that would have impressed the professors at any Eastern university, though none of them would ever see his work. He filled journal after journal with dense, meticulous notes, cross-sections of the geology beneath the surface, measurements of rainfall, absorption calculations of porosity and permeability that read like scripture written in the language of stone. Agnes had watched him do this for 40 years. She had read every journal. She had listened to every theory he tested aloud over their evening meals, using her as his sounding board, his classroom of one. And though she had never swung a pickaxe into the anvil's hide, she understood what lay beneath it as well as any living person. Perhaps better, because Ezra had understood the science, but Agnes understood how to teach it, how to take a complex truth and make it simple enough for anyone to grasp. She understood the weight of an idea and how to carry it into a room full of people who did not want to hear it. She would need that skill now. The meeting in the town hall that December evening was not about Agnes or her inheritance. It was about water, or rather the terrifying absence of it. The Redemption River, which had carved the valley into existence over millennia, had been shrinking for months. What had once been a broad, confident flow of clear water was now a languid, muddy ribbon barely wide enough to wet a horse's ankles. The winter snows of the previous year had been a cruel disappointment, a mere dusting that vanished within a week. The spring rains had never arrived. And now, as December settled its cold hand over the valley, the drought was no longer a concern. It was a crisis. The shallow wells that had served the families of Redemption for generations, wells dug with confidence near the riverbank and lined with fieldstone, were beginning to draw up more mud than water. The autumn harvest had been a disaster. Corn stalks stood stunted and yellow in the fields like rows of tired soldiers who had lost the will to stand. The cattle, the true currency of the valley, were growing thin, their ribs showing through their hides like the slats of a broken fence. The town hall was packed that night. Nearly every soul in Redemption had come. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and sweat and something harder to name: fear. The particular kind of fear that comes when the thing you have always taken for granted, the thing that flows and fills and sustains without your ever having to think about it, simply stops. At the front of the room, behind a table scarred with decades of use, sat the man who had called this meeting, Judge Harlan Croft. He was not, in fact, a judge. He had never studied law and had never sat on any bench. The title was honorific, bestowed upon him years ago by men who recognized in Croft a force that was easier to yield to than oppose. He was 68 years old, built like a man who had spent his youth wrestling steers and his middle age wrestling lesser men into submission. His face was weathered brown leather, stretched over sharp bones, and his eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a sky that had forgotten how to rain. His wealth was measured in cattle and land. His influence was measured in the silence that fell whenever he spoke. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, the deepest private well, and the unquestioned loyalty of every man on the town council. He was in every way that mattered in Redemption the law. "We will deepen the town well," Croft declared, his voice filling the room the way floodwater fills a basement, leaving no space for anything else. "Another 20 feet should see us through the worst of it, and every family will begin rationing immediately, a bucket a day for the household, half a bucket for each head of stock." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "It will be difficult, but it is the sensible course, the proven course. Our fathers dug these wells and their fathers before them. The water has always been there, and it will be there again. We simply need to go deeper." A murmur of grim acceptance rolled through the crowd. It was a harsh plan, but it was a plan. More importantly, it was familiar. It required no new thinking, no leap of faith, no admission that the old ways might have reached their limit. It was simply more of what they had always done, and that was enough for most of them. From the back of the room near the door, Agnes Wardwell cleared her throat. The sound was small, an old woman's quiet cough, the kind that is easily ignored in a room full of anxious men. But something in it, some quality of deliberateness, cut through the noise like a blade drawn slowly across glass. The room turned. Agnes stood near the doorframe, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture as straight as a fence post. She was a small woman made smaller by age and by the black wool dress she still wore in mourning for Ezra. Her hair was white, pulled back in a tight bun that accentuated the sharp angles of her face. Her skin was lined and weathered, mapped with the years the way the mesa was mapped with the centuries. But her eyes were clear, and in them was something that made several men in that room look away without understanding why. "Deepening the well will not work," she said. Her voice was not loud. She did not need it to be. She had spent 31 years in a classroom, and she knew that the most powerful statement was the one delivered with absolute calm into absolute silence. "The river is not simply low," she continued. "The water table itself is falling. It has been falling for 2 years. The shallow aquifers that feed your wells are connected to the river, and when the river goes, they go with it. Digging 20 feet deeper into the same aquifer is like digging a deeper hole in the bottom of an empty bucket." The silence that followed was not the respectful kind. It was the kind that precedes laughter. Harlan Croft turned his head slowly, the way a bull turns toward a sound it finds more irritating than threatening. He looked at Agnes the way a man looks at a fly that has landed on his dinner plate. Not with anger, but with a faint, dismissive annoyance. And what he said, his voice rich with the particular condescension that powerful men reserve for those they consider beneath serious conversation. "Does the school teacher suggest we do?" He did not say her name. He did not need to. In a room full of ranchers and farmers, the word school teacher was diminishment enough. Agnes did not flinch. She had been diminished before. She had been diminished her entire life by men who measured value in acreage and head of cattle and the depth of a man's voice. She had learned long ago that a flinch was a concession, and she was not in the business of conceding. "The sandstone stratum of the anvil," she said, "is porous. It has been absorbing and filtering rainwater for centuries, holding it deep within its layers, protected from the sun and wind. The mesa acts as a natural cistern. The water is there, not in a pool, not in a stream, but held within the rock itself in the spaces between the grains of sand. Millions of gallons of it accumulated over time beyond our reckoning. She paused, letting the idea settle. She could see it was not settling well. It can be collected, she said, through a system of vertical shafts and horizontal galleries carved into the water-bearing layer. It is an ancient method proven for thousands of years in the deserts of Persia and North Africa. My husband documented the geology in detail. The water is there. It simply needs to be reached. The silence held for one more beat. Then Harlan Croft laughed. It was a big, full-bodied laugh, the kind that filled a room not with humor, but with power. It was the laugh of a man who controlled the narrative and intended to keep controlling it. And like a stone dropped into still water, it sent ripples outward. Other men laughed too, some nervously, some with genuine amusement, a few with the uncomfortable relief of men who were glad someone else was the target. "Squeeze water from a rock," Croft said, shaking his head slowly as if savoring the absurdity. "Is that what Ezra Wardwell was doing up there, boss? All those years I always wondered." More laughter, louder now. It fed on itself. A farmer near the middle of the room, a lean, sunburned man named Peterson, leaned forward in his chair. "A shaft and galleries," he called out. "That would take a crew of 20 men and a year of work. You've got no crew, no money, and nothing but that useless rock." "I will do the work myself," Agnes said. The laughter stopped, not because they believed her, but because the statement was so far beyond the boundary of anything they considered possible that it left them momentarily speechless. A 62-year-old widow alone proposing to dig into solid rock with hand tools. It was not a plan. It was a delusion. Harlan Croft stepped forward. He removed his hat, a gesture he used when he wished to project sincerity, and he held it against his chest. His expression shifted from amusement to something that resembled concern, though those who knew him well could see the contempt beneath it, the way dark water moves beneath a thin layer of ice. "Agnes," he said, using her first name as one might use the name of a confused child, "your grief has taken hold of you. We all understand that. Ezra was a good man, if a peculiar one, and losing him has been hard. But this is not the time for his theories. This is the time for practical men to do practical work." He let that word hang in the air. Men. Practical. "Sell the anvil to me," he said. "I will give you a fair price. $50. That is more than generous for a pile of rock that cannot grow a single blade of grass. Take the money. Move to the city. Find a more comfortable life. Leave the problem of water to those who understand it." The room waited. Agnes looked at Croft. She looked at him the way she had once looked at a student who had given a confidently wrong answer to a simple question. With patience, with the knowledge that correction was necessary even when it would not be welcome. "The land is not for sale," she said, "and my judgment is perfectly clear, Judge Croft. Clearer perhaps than it has ever been." She let her gaze sweep the room, taking in every face, every pair of eyes that would not meet hers. "You are all looking for water in a drying pan," she said, "while ignoring the reservoir sitting on the hill above you. I will begin work tomorrow. And when your wells are empty and your cattle are dead and your children are crying for a drink of water, you will remember this conversation." She turned and walked out of the town hall. The door closed behind her with a sound that was neither loud nor soft. It was simply final. Inside, the room erupted in murmurs, derisive, pitying, dismissive. "Poor woman's lost her mind," Peterson muttered. "Grief and loneliness. It happens." "Digging into solid rock," another man said, shaking his head. "At her age. Someone should stop her before she kills herself up there." Harlan Croft said nothing. He put his hat back on and turned to the crowd with the practiced ease of a man redirecting attention. "As I was saying," he said, his voice smooth and certain, "we begin deepening the town well at first light." Not one man in that room questioned him. Not one of them had inherited a pile of worthless stone. Not one of them had spent 40 years listening to a geologist whisper about the secrets held in sandstone. And not one of them in their collective, practical, masculine wisdom was willing to entertain the possibility that a 62-year-old widow might see something they could not. Agnes walked home in the dark. The trail up to the anvil was steep and winding, carved by the hooves of mules and the boots of one man who had walked it 10,000 times, Ezra's trail. She knew every turn, every loose stone, every place where the juniper roots crossed the path like the gnarled knuckles of a buried hand. She did not need a lantern. Her feet knew the way as surely as her lungs knew how to breathe. The night was cold and clear. Above her, the stars were hard white points, scattered across a sky so deep it seemed to have no bottom. The moon was a thin crescent, offering just enough light to paint the mesa's edge in silver. Below in the valley, she could see the faint glow of oil lamps in the windows of the town. Small, warm squares of light, each one a family gathered around their table, talking in low voices about the drought, about rationing, about whether the rain would ever come back. She reached the top of the mesa and stood there breathing hard from the climb. The wind met her as it always did, a constant, restless presence that swept across the flat stone surface like an invisible hand trying to push her back down. She leaned into it. She had been leaning into winds her whole life. The cabin was small. Ezra had built it himself from the very stone he had spent his life studying, a single room with walls 2 feet thick that stayed cool in summer and held warmth in winter. Inside it was spare, but not empty. A narrow bed, a cast iron stove, a table buried beneath the organized chaos of Ezra's journals, his maps, his samples of rock labeled in his small, precise handwriting. Agnes lit the stove and put a kettle on. She sat down at the table and opened the journal she had been reading for the past 3 nights. It was volume 14 of 37. The entry was dated August 1868, a full decade before the drought that was now killing the valley. Ezra's handwriting filled the page. The redemption sandstone he had written is the key to the entire mesa. It is a water-bearing stratum of remarkable porosity, approximately 80 feet thick at its widest point, lying beneath a cap of impervious shale, urging 12 feet in depth. The sandstone absorbs precipitation through microfractures in the overlying limestone and holds it within its pore spaces through capillary tension. My calculations suggest the mesa contains a stored volume of water, sufficient to supply the needs of the entire valley for decades, perhaps longer. The challenge is extraction. The water will not come willingly. It must be given a path. A low-pressure gradient must be created to induce seepage, and this requires not depth but surface area, not a well but a gallery. Agnes closed the journal. She did not need to read more. She had memorized these passages years ago. Ezra had taught her everything he knew, not in the way a professor teaches a student, but in the way a river shapes the land it flows through, slowly, constantly, irrevocably. She knew the geology of the anvil as intimately as she knew the lines on her own hands. What she did not know was whether her body at 62 could do what her mind understood. She looked down at her hands. They were the hands of a schoolteacher, thin-skinned, accustomed to chalk and paper, not steel and stone. The knuckles were swollen from the years, the joints stiff on cold mornings. She flexed them, feeling the familiar ache. These hands would have to break rock. These hands would have to swing a pickaxe 10,000 times, would have to haul buckets of stone up a 16-foot shaft, would have to carve chambers and galleries in the belly of the earth. She looked at them a long time. Then she wrapped them around the warm tin cup of tea and began to plan. The next morning, December the 19th, 1878, Agnes walked into the general store in Redemption. The proprietor, a thin, careful man named Hollis Miller, watched her enter with the expression of a man who has already heard the gossip and is trying very hard not to let it show on his face. The news of her speech at the town hall had spread through the valley overnight, carried by the same invisible current that carried all news in small communities. The widow Wardwell wants to dig for water in the anvil, has lost her mind. Grief, loneliness. Someone should do something. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," Agnes said in the same tone she had used for 3 decades when greeting her students. Pleasant, brisk, allowing no room for pity. "Morning, Mrs. Wardwell," Miller replied, wiping his hands on his apron. "What can I do for you?" Agnes placed a list on the counter. She had written it the night before in the same careful hand she had used to write lessons on a chalkboard. It was precise and without excess. 12 steel drill bits tempered, 100 feet of thick hemp rope, 2 oak buckets iron-banded, 1 block and tackle with a forged steel hook, 10 pounds of tallow candles, 3 gallons of lamp oil. Miller read the list. He looked up at her. He looked back at the list. He knew what these supplies were for. Everyone in town knew. "Mrs. Wardwell," he began, his voice careful, the way one speaks to someone who might be gently steered away from a mistake. "That is a considerable purchase. Are you certain that—" "The total, Mr. Miller." He calculated it in his head, then on paper, then he told her. $27. Agnes opened the small wooden box she carried in her coat pocket. Inside was $47 in silver coins, the last of Ezra's savings. Every cent they had accumulated over a lifetime of modest living. She counted out $27, each coin placed on the counter, with the deliberate care of a woman who understood that what remained $20 was all that stood between her and destitution. Miller swept the coins into his register. He gathered her supplies without further comment, wrapping the drill bits in burlap, coiling the rope, testing the block and tackle to ensure its mechanism was sound. Whatever he thought of her plan, he was a merchant, and her money was as good as any man's. Agnes loaded the supplies onto the small handcart she had pulled down from the mesa. It was a heavy load for a woman of any age, and she felt every pound of it in her shoulders and lower back as she pulled it up the winding trail. The cart's wooden wheels groaned against the stone. Her boots slipped on the loose gravel. Twice she had to stop and rest, leaning against the cart with her hands on her knees, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that tasted of dust and iron. But she did not stop for long, and she did not look back at the town below. She did not begin digging immediately. This surprised no one because no one was watching. But if they had been, they might have been surprised by a different reason. Agnes did not delay out of hesitation or doubt. She delayed because she was a teacher, and a teacher does not begin a lesson without preparation. For 3 full days, she spread Ezra's maps across the flat stone surface of the mesa and studied them with an intensity that blocked out everything else. The wind, the cold, the ache in her joints, all of it receded before the focus of a mind engaged in its truest work. Ezra's maps were not simple sketches of the surface. They were complex cross-sections of the geology beneath, layers drawn with the precision of an architect and annotated with the density of a scientist. He had spent decades mapping the invisible world below the anvil, charting its strata the way a navigator charts an ocean. Shale capped the notes read, non-porous, average thickness 12 feet. Beneath it lies redemption sandstone, highly porous and water-bearing. Stratum approximately 80 feet thick. Water held in tension within pore spaces. Key is to create a low-pressure gradient to induce seepage. Optimal point is the southwest declination, where sandstone is thickest and closest to surface. Agnes cross-referenced his triangulation points, which Ezra had marked years ago, with small cairns of stacked stones on the mesa's surface. She used a plumb line fashioned from a lead weight and a length of twine, and a spirit level of her own, making a wooden trough filled with water to find the precise spot where the water-bearing layer would be most accessible. She found it on the mesa's gentle southwestern slope, the spot where Ezra's calculations converged like the lines of a compass pointing to buried treasure. Though treasure was too romantic a word for what lay below, it was something far more valuable than gold. It was survival itself. On the evening of the 3rd day, she marked the spot with a circle of white stones precisely 4 feet in diameter. She stood at the center of that circle as the sun went down, casting her long shadow across the pale rock. She was 62 years old. She was alone. She had $20 a set of hand tools and the accumulated knowledge of a dead man's lifetime of work. Tomorrow she would begin. That night, something happened that changed the nature of her task. She had walked the perimeter of the mesa at dusk, as she did each evening, checking the cairns Ezra had placed at his survey points. It was habit ritual, the kind of small act that kept his memory close. She knew the position of every cairn, their height, their composition, the particular way each stack of stones balanced against the wind. 3 of them had been disturbed, not toppled, not scattered as wind or an animal might do, moved, shifted several feet from their original positions, then restacked with a carelessness that was unmistakable. Someone had been up here. Someone had been examining Ezra's survey markers, and that someone had tried clumsily to put them back. Agnes crouched beside one of the displaced cairns. The ground around it showed faint marks, boot prints partially erased by wind, but still visible in the lee of the stones. Large boots, a man's stride. She sat back on her heels and looked down at the valley. In the fading light, she could just make out the dark shape of Harlan Croft's ranch, the largest structure in the valley, sprawling and confident in its command of the best land. Croft had offered her $50 for the anvil. She had assumed it was a gesture of condescension, a rich man tossing a coin to a foolish widow. But now a different possibility took shape in her mind. What if Croft knew? What if he had suspected even dimly what Ezra had discovered? What if the offer to buy was not charity but acquisition? It changed nothing about her plan, but it changed everything about her caution. From that night forward, Agnes altered her routine. She worked during the hours when the valley could not easily see her. She erected a rough windbreak of juniper branches and canvas around the mouth of her excavation site, ostensibly against the wind, but positioned to block the line of sight from below. She kept no regular schedule that could be observed and predicted. She told no one what she had found. She told no one what she was doing. She was 62 years old and she was going to war with stone. And now she knew she might also be going to war with something else. On the morning of December the 19th, Agnes Wardwell descended into the circle of white stones and swung her pickaxe for the first time. The first 5 feet were compacted soil and sun-baked clay, a difficult but familiar adversary. The shovel bit into it with a satisfying crunch, and she fell into a rhythm that was almost meditative. Dig, lift, toss, dig, lift, toss. The pile of excavated earth grew beside the hole like a small brown monument to the beginning of something no one else believed in. Then she hit the capstone. The sound changed. The soft thud of metal and earth became the sharp, jarring ring of steel against stone. The capstone was a layer of calcium-rich rock siete that Ezra's journals described as being as hard as poured concrete. And his description, Agnes quickly discovered, was generous. Each swing of the pickaxe was a violent conversation between steel and stone, and the stone was winning. The shock traveled up the hickory handle and through her wrists and into the bones of her arms with a force that rattled her teeth. She struck the same spot 10 times, 20 times, 30, and was rewarded at last with a single fist-sized chunk of rock that broke free and tumbled to the bottom of the hole with a dull mocking clatter. The sun beat down. The wind offered no relief, only a dry, abrasive presence that scoured her exposed skin and filled her eyes with grit. The heat radiated from the stone walls of her growing pit, creating a furnace effect that made the air shimmer and dance. She worked from the moment the sun cleared the eastern ridge until the light failed in the west. Her hands blistered on the first day. The blisters broke on the second. By the end of the first week, her palms were raw, cracked landscapes of torn skin that wept clear fluid and left rust-colored stains on the handle of her pickaxe. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old cotton shirt and kept going. To remove the debris from the deepening hole, she built a winch. She sank 2 thick juniper posts on either side of the shaft and laid a greased wooden axle between them. Her rope threaded through the block, and tackle allowed her to haul the loaded buckets to the surface with a mechanical advantage that her aging body desperately needed. Even so, each bucket was a small war. Fill it with broken stone, clip it to the hook, climb the ladder, haul the rope hand over hand, dump the load, descend, begin again. She counted the buckets. On the first day, she hauled 19. By the end of the first week, she had lost count, and her shoulders ached with a deep, hot pain that did not fade with sleep. The people in the valley below could sometimes see her silhouette against the sky, a small, dark figure moving with a slow, dogged rhythm on the edge of the mesa. They would watch for a moment, shake their heads, and return to the grim business of deepening their own well, which was already drawing more sand than water. "Still at it," Peterson would say to whoever was listening. "Still crazy," someone would answer. And the laughter that followed was always a little quieter than the time before, because the wells were failing, and the river was dying, and the sky remained a vast, empty, merciless blue, from horizon to horizon, offering nothing. And up on the anvil, the old woman kept digging, day after day after day, as if she knew something they did not, as if the stone had whispered to her a secret it had kept for 1,000 years. And she had believed it. 2 weeks into the work, Agnes Wardwell was 12 feet down. The shaft was a rough square 4 feet across carved into the body of the mesa with nothing but hand tools and a will that had no apparent bottom. The walls were a record of her descent. The first 5 feet of pale compacted clay. Then the hard cream-colored band of the capstone still bearing the white scars where her pickaxe had chipped and hammered and pried it apart inch by agonizing inch. Below that, the transition zone, a crumbling layer, where calcium gave way to the denser, darker material beneath. She was in the shale now. It was a different kind of enemy. The capstone had been hard but honest. It resisted, and when it broke clean. The shale was treacherous. It chipped away in greasy gray-black flakes that coated everything they touched, her tools, her clothes, her skin, her lungs. It crumbled unpredictably, sometimes giving way in satisfying slabs, sometimes refusing to yield to 100 blows, then suddenly fracturing along a hidden fault line and sending a shower of razor-edged fragments clattering down the shaft. The dust was the worst of it. Fine as flour and dark as ash, it hung in the still air at the bottom of the shaft like a living thing, filling her nose and mouth with every breath. She tied a cotton cloth over her face, but within an hour it was black and heavy with the grit, and her breathing became a labored, wheezing effort that frightened her more than she would admit. She was 62 years old. Her body reminded her of this fact every morning. The stiffness in her knees when she first stood from the narrow bed, the deep grinding ache in her lower back that no amount of stretching could fully release. The swollen knuckles of her hands, which now took several minutes of painful flexing before they would close properly around the handle of the pickaxe. But pain, Agnes had learned, was not the same thing as defeat. Pain was information. It told her where she was broken and where she was merely bent, and she had spent a lifetime learning the difference. Her routine was monastic in its discipline. She rose before dawn when the sky was still a deep bruise of indigo above the mesa's edge. She ate a small meal of hard bread and dried beef food chosen not for pleasure, but for endurance, for the slow release of energy that would carry her through 12 hours of labor. She drank 2 cups of water, measured carefully from the barrel she hauled up from the valley's last functioning spring once a week. Then she lit her lanterns, 2 of them, one for the bottom of the shaft and one hung halfway up the ladder to mark her way back to the surface, and she descended. The ladder was a crude thing built from juniper poles and rawhide lashing. It creaked under her weight with a sound that she had come to find almost companionable, a familiar voice in a world that had grown very quiet. At the bottom, she would set her lantern in a niche she had carved into the wall and pick up her tools. And then the work. Swing, crack, pry, fill the bucket, climb the ladder, haul the rope, dump the load, descend, begin again. She did this until the light failed or her body refused, whichever came first. Most evenings it was a draw. The pile of excavated rock on the mesa's surface grew steadily a gray-black mountain of shale fragments that the wind scattered into long trailing tails across the pale limestone. From the valley below, it was the only visible evidence that anything was happening on the anvil at all. A slowly growing smudge of dark stone against the lighter rock, like a bruise spreading across skin. On the night of January the 2nd, 1879, the rain came. It arrived without warning, the sudden violent cloud bank that rolled over the mesa from the northwest and opened with a fury that seemed personal. Agnes woke to the sound of water hammering on the stone roof of the cabin, and for one disoriented moment felt a surge of hope. Rain. At last. Then she understood. She was out of bed and running before she had fully formed the thought. Running across the flat stone surface of the mesa in her nightdress, the rain driving into her face like needles of ice, the wind tearing at her hair. She could hear it before she reached the shaft. A sound like a throat swallowing, the sound of water finding a hole and filling it. She reached the edge and looked down. The shaft was flooding. The rain, which had no soil to absorb it on the bare stone mesa, was sheeting across the surface in a thin, fast-moving film and pouring over the lip of the excavation in a dozen small waterfalls. At the bottom, 12 feet down, the water was already 2 feet deep and rising a churning brown soup of rainwater and dissolved shale that was undermining the walls with a speed that turned her stomach to ice. As she watched, a section of the shaft's eastern wall simply fell away. Not crumbled, fell. A slab of shale 4 feet wide and 2 feet thick, detached from the wall, with a wet sucking sound and collapsed into the rising water, sending a plume of muddy spray up toward her face. She had no time for fear. Fear was a luxury for people with options. Agnes grabbed the canvas tarpaulin she had been using as a windbreak and dragged it across the mouth of the shaft. She weighted its edges with stones, working with a desperate fumbling speed, her fingers numb with cold and slick with rain. It was not a seal. Water still found its way beneath the edges, still trickled and seeped toward the hole. But it slowed the flow. It bought her time. Then she began to dig a diversion trench. In the dark. In the rain. In her nightdress and bare feet on the cold, slippery stone. She used the shovel, driving it into the shallow soil that collected in the mesa's cracks and depressions, carving a rough channel that angled away from the shaft toward the mesa's edge. The work was frantic and brutal. The rain did not relent. Her hands, already raw from weeks of labor, split open again, and the rainwater found the wounds with a stinging precision that made her gasp. She worked for 3 hours. By the time the storm passed, rolling eastward with a last rumble of thunder that sounded like laughter, she had carved a drainage channel 30 feet long and 6 inches deep. It was crude. It was ugly. But it worked. The water that had been pooling around the shaft mouth was now draining away toward the mesa's edge and cascading down the cliff face in a thin, dirty waterfall. When dawn came, Agnes descended the ladder to assess the damage. It was worse than she had feared. The eastern wall of the shaft had partially collapsed. A section roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet wide had sloughed away, creating a ragged cavity that had widened the shaft unevenly and deposited a mound of wet shale debris at the bottom. The water level had receded as it drained through the porous lower layers, but the walls were saturated and unstable, oozing dark moisture, like a wound that would not close. She sat on the bottom rung of the ladder and looked at the destruction. 4 days of work, gone, erased by a single night of rain that, in a bitter irony, was not nearly enough to help the valley. The storm had been violent but brief, the kind that runs off the hard ground without penetrating, offering fury but no sustenance. She sat there for a long time. The lantern flickered in the damp air, casting trembling shadows on the damaged walls. Her body ached in places she did not have names for. Her hands throbbed. Her back was a continuous sheet of pain from the base of her skull to her tailbone. She was cold. She was wet. She was 62 years old and sitting at the bottom of a hole in the ground, alone in the dark, and the hole was trying to kill her. She thought about Ezra, not about his journals or his maps or his theories about sandstone porosity. She thought about the man himself, the way he would sit in his chair by the stove on winter evenings reading his journals aloud to her, his voice low and steady and filled with a certainty that was not arrogance but faith. Faith in the stone, faith in the water hidden within it, faith that the earth was not an enemy to be conquered but a puzzle to be understood. The rock is not your adversary, he had written in Journal 23. She did not need to open it. She had read the passage so many times it was carved into her memory the way the mesa was carved by wind. It is your most patient ally. It has been holding water for you since before you were born. You simply have to ask it correctly. Agnes looked at the collapsed wall, at the mound of wet debris, at the work that lay ahead of her work that would take 4 days just to undo the damage before she could advance a single inch further. She stood up. She picked up the shovel. She began clearing the debris. It took her 4 full days to repair the shaft. She rebuilt the collapsed section by shoring it with flat stones wedged tightly against the shale, creating a rough retaining wall that would hold against future saturation. She deepened and improved the drainage channel on the surface, extending it to 50 feet and lining its edges with stones to prevent erosion. She fashioned a better cover for the shaft mouth, a frame of juniper poles over which she stretched the canvas slope to shed water away from the opening. She did all of this with hands that were swollen and cracked and stiff with pain. She did it on rations of bread and jerky that were growing dangerously thin. She did it alone. On the evening of the 4th day, as she sat on the mesa's edge, eating her meager supper, she noticed something at the base of the trail. A basket. She walked down and found it tucked behind a rock, sheltered from the wind. Inside was a cloth bundle containing a loaf of fresh bread, a small jar of preserves, a piece of salt pork wrapped in wax paper, and a tin of medicinal salve. There was no note, no name. Agnes looked down the trail toward the valley. She could see the roofs of the town in the distance, the church steeple catching the last light. She could not see who had left it. She picked up the basket and carried it back to the cabin. She never learned with certainty who had left it, though she had her suspicions. Ruth Croft, the young wife of Harlan Croft's eldest son, was a quiet woman with gentle hands and a habit of looking away when her father-in-law spoke. Agnes had taught her in school years ago, had seen in her the particular kind of intelligence that survives by hiding itself. The baskets appeared every week after that, always at the base of the trail, always without a note. The bread changed, the preserves changed, but the salve was always the same. A camphor and beeswax mixture that was the only thing that kept Agnes's hands from splitting open entirely. She never sought out her benefactor. She never spoke of it. Some kindnesses are most powerful when they remain unacknowledged, existing in the silent space between two people who understand each other without the need for words. Below in the valley, the drought was becoming something worse than a crisis. It was becoming an extinction. By the end of January, the town well, despite having been deepened by 30 feet at considerable expense, had gone completely dry. The moment was witnessed by a dozen men who had gathered at dawn to draw the day's ration. The bucket went down, the rope went taut, the bucket came up. Inside was a quart of brown mud and a handful of wet sand. They lowered it again, and again, and again. Mud, sand, nothing. The Redemption River was no longer a river. It was a memory. Its bed was a cracked, white expanse of baked clay, littered with the papery husks of dead fish and the bleached shells of freshwater mussels. Walking across it was like walking across the floor of a world that had given up. The cattle were dying, not the slow, gradual thinning of animals on short rations, but the sudden, terrible dying of beasts whose bodies had simply reached the end of what they could endure without water. They would stand in the fields, motionless, their heads hanging low, and then they would fold their legs, buckling beneath them, with a quietness that was somehow worse than any sound. By February, the communal pasture was a graveyard. The smell carried for miles. Harlan Croft's empire was crumbling. His ranch, the largest in the valley, was the hardest hit. He had more cattle than anyone, and more cattle meant more thirst. He sold what he could to buyers from less afflicted regions, but the prices were devastating. Animals that had been worth $40 a head 6 months ago went for 3, for 2, for whatever a desperate man could get from a buyer who knew he had no choice. His private well, the deepest in the county, had failed in late January. He had responded the way he responded to every problem with money and force. He sent word to Denver and hired a man. Garrett Loomis arrived in Redemption on the 2nd of February with a wagon loaded with equipment that none of the townsfolk had ever seen. He was a lean, sharp-faced man of 40, an engineer by training, a driller by trade, with the confident manner of a professional who had solved problems like this before. He wore a clean shirt and spoke in the clipped, precise cadences of a man from the East who had come west to make his fortune selling expertise to those who lacked it. Croft paid him well. The figure was not discussed publicly, but the rumors placed it somewhere north of $300, a staggering sum that represented a significant portion of Croft's rapidly diminishing reserves. Loomis surveyed the valley floor for 2 days, taking measurements with instruments that glinted in the sun, consulting charts that he spread across the tailgate of his wagon with the careful authority of a surgeon preparing for an operation. The townsfolk watched him with a desperate, almost religious hope. Here at last was science, real science. Not the ramblings of a dead man's journals, but the polished, credentialed, machinery-backed certainty of the modern age. The drilling began on the 4th of February. The rig was a marvel of engineering, a tall wooden derrick fitted with a steam-powered percussion mechanism that drove a hardened steel bit into the earth with a rhythmic, bone-shaking thud that could be heard across the valley. Each impact sent a small plume of dust into the air, and the townsfolk gathered at a respectful distance to watch, their faces tight with the kind of hope that is indistinguishable from prayer. The drill went down, 10 feet, 20, 40, 60, dry rock, clay, more dry rock. Loomis adjusted his calculations. He moved the rig 100 yards to the east to a spot his measurements indicated might intersect a deeper formation. The steam engine chugged and hammered. The derrick groaned. The steel bit chewed into the earth with a sound like the slow grinding of God's own teeth. 80 feet, 90, 100, and then at 106 feet the bit struck granite. The sound was unmistakable. The rhythmic thudding of the percussion rig changed to a high shrieking whine, steel screaming against a stone that would not yield. The drill bit, which had cost $30 and was supposed to be the hardest tool money could buy, shattered against the unyielding bedrock like glass against an anvil. The silence that followed was absolute. Loomis pulled the broken bit from the hole and examined it with the expression of a man reading his own obituary. He stood there for a long time, surrounded by his expensive equipment, his charts, his instruments, his credentials, and he said the words that no one in Redemption wanted to hear. There is no accessible water beneath this valley floor. The granite shelf is continuous. You cannot drill through it. Not with my equipment. Not with any equipment currently in existence. He paused. He looked at the ring of desperate faces. I am sorry. He packed his rig the next morning and left Redemption without looking back. The $300 was gone. The hope was gone. The deepest hole in the valley was 106 feet of dry, useless stone, a monument to the failure of modern engineering and the limits of money and force. Harlan Croft stood at the edge of that empty hole for a long time after Loomis had gone. He stared into it as if it were a mirror. On January the 12th, 1879, 24 days after she had begun, Agnes Wardwell's pickaxe broke through the bottom of the shale. She was 16 feet deep. She had been swinging the pickaxe in a steady mechanical rhythm, her mind in the blank meditative state that hours of repetitive labor produces when the point of the tool, instead of meeting the familiar jarring resistance of the shale, punched through into something soft. The sensation was so unexpected that she nearly lost her balance. She steadied herself against the wall and looked down at the small hole her pickaxe had made. It was no larger than her fist, but from it rose something that stopped her breath. Air, cool air, damp air, air that carried a scent she had almost forgotten existed in this parched, dying land. The clean mineral smell of deep earth and water. It rose from the opening like the breath of a sleeping giant, steady and cool, and impossibly miraculously moist. Agnes knelt. She extended her hand toward the hole, and the cool air flowed over her cracked, calloused fingers like a benediction. She pushed her hand into the opening and felt the rock beyond. It was gritty, coarse-grained, and wet. The Redemption sandstone. She had reached it. Agnes pulled her hand back and looked at it in the lantern light. Her palm was dark with moisture. Actual moisture. Water held in the pores of the stone for centuries, perhaps millennia, waiting in the darkness for someone to come and find it. Her knees buckled. Not from weakness, though she was weaker than she had ever been in her life. They buckled from something that felt like the opposite of weakness. A release. A validation so profound and so long deferred that her body did not know how to contain it. She sat on the floor of the shaft, her back against the rough wall, her ruined hands resting in her lap, and she wept. Not loudly, not dramatically. She wept the way the sandstone wept. Slowly, quietly, with a patience that had been earned through suffering. Ezra had been right. The water was here. It had always been here, hidden in the stone that everyone had dismissed as worthless, held in the patient, porous body of the rock that had been called useless, that had been laughed at, that had been offered for $50 to a woman they thought was losing her mind. She sat in the dark and the damp, and she let the tears come. They fell on her hands and mixed with the moisture from the stone, and for a moment there was no difference between the water of the earth and the water of a woman's grief and relief. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, and she picked up her tools. Because reaching the water was not the end. It was the beginning of the hardest work of all. In the first week of March, Harlan Croft rode up the Anvil Trail with two men. Peterson was one. Davies, a thin, nervous rancher whose land bordered Croft's to the east, was the other. Their horses were gaunt, their ribs showing through dull, patchy coats. The men looked no better. The drought had aged them all by a decade. Their skin was tight against their skulls, their eyes sunken in hollows of shadow. They found Agnes near the mouth of the shaft, hauling a bucket of sandstone rubble to the surface with her rope and pulley. She was covered in the reddish grit of the water-bearing layer, her white hair stained the color of rust, her clothes stiff with dried mud. But her movements were efficient and strong, the movements of a body that had been stripped of everything unnecessary and forged into a tool for one purpose. "Still playing in your mud puddle," Peterson called out, though his voice was thin and carried none of the conviction it had held in the town hall 3 months earlier. It was the echo of a joke that no one found funny anymore. Agnes set the bucket down. She looked at the three men. She looked at their horses. She said nothing. Croft dismounted with the stiff, careful movements of a man whose joints have forgotten how to bend easily. He stood 10 feet from the shaft mouth, his hat in his hands. The posture of authority was still there, embedded in his bones like a fossil, but the substance behind it had been hollowed out. "There is no water here," he said. His voice was a dry rasp, barely above a whisper. It was not a question. It was a plea, the last desperate assertion of a man who needed his own judgment to be confirmed. Because if it was wrong about this, it was wrong about everything, and that was a weight he could not bear. Agnes looked at him. Then she walked to a large wooden barrel that stood near the shaft entrance, covered with a fitted plank to prevent evaporation. She lifted the plank. She dipped a ladle into the barrel. She raised it to her own lips and drank slowly, deliberately, letting the water catch the sunlight as it spilled over the edge of the ladle and ran down her chin. Then she filled the ladle again and held it out toward them. "The sandstone is porous," she said, her voice steady. "The water is held in tension within the stone. You have to give it time and a place to go." The three men stared at the ladle. The water in it was clear, perfectly, impossibly clear. It caught the light and threw tiny dancing reflections across the dusty ground. In a valley where the last clean water had been a memory for months, the sight of it was almost hallucinatory. Peterson reached for it first. His hand was trembling. He took the ladle from Agnes and brought it to his lips and drank. His eyes closed. His throat convulsed. A sound came from him that was not quite a word and not quite a sob. Something in between. Davies drank after him. He said nothing. He simply stood there with his eyes closed and his shoulders shaking. Croft did not drink. He stared at the ladle, at the barrel, at the mouth of the shaft from which the cool, damp air rose like the breath of another world. The evidence was undeniable. Water on this God-forsaken plateau. Water from the very rock he had called useless. Water found by the very woman he had dismissed. But Harlan Croft's pride was as deep and hard as the granite shelf his driller had struck at 106 feet. It was the bedrock of his identity, the foundation upon which he had built his life, his ranch, his authority, and his certainty that he understood the way the world worked better than anyone else in the valley. To drink that water was to admit that he had been wrong. Not just wrong about the anvil, wrong about Agnes, wrong about Ezra, wrong about the nature of water and the nature of stone and the nature of a woman's mind. He could not do it. Not yet. He grunted, he turned. He mounted his horse with a stiffness that betrayed his years, and he rode away down the trail without a word, his councilman falling in behind him like the rear guard of a retreating army. But before he left, he stopped his horse and turned back. His face in that moment was not angry. It was something worse. It was afraid. "That water," he said, his voice carrying the ragged edge of a threat, "if it is real, is a public resource. Public resources can be claimed for the common good. You would do well to remember that, Mrs. Wardwell." Agnes watched him go. She understood the threat. She understood it perfectly. Harlan Croft could not accept that he had been wrong, but he could accept ownership of the thing that proved it if he could find a way to take it from her. She turned back to her shaft. She had more work to do. And now she had a reason to work faster. The main chamber was the cathedral. That was how Agnes thought of it, though she would never have said the word aloud. It was not a place of worship. It was a place of engineering, of geometry, of the careful, patient manipulation of stone and gravity and water. But there was something sacred about it nonetheless. Something in the silence, in the cool, still air, in the slow, steady weeping of moisture from walls that had held their burden for longer than human memory. She carved it from the redemption sandstone with a methodical precision that Ezra would have recognized and approved. The chamber was 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 7 feet high, large enough for her to stand upright at its center, large enough to hold the reservoir that would be its purpose. The process was painstaking. She would use a hand drill and a hammer to bore a series of small holes into the rock face, each hole 6 inches deep and spaced 8 inches apart. Then she would drive iron wedges into the holes one at a time, tapping each with gradually increasing force. The trick was patience. You did not strike the wedges hard, you struck them often. A dozen light taps, then moved to the next wedge, then the next, then back to the first. Over and over, each tap fractionally widening the stress lines in the stone, each cycle bringing the rock incrementally closer to the moment when it would surrender. When it broke along the lines she had drawn. A slab of damp sandstone 2 inches thick and sometimes as large as a tabletop would detach from the face with a low, satisfying crack and fall to the floor. She would break it into manageable pieces, load them into her buckets, and haul them to the surface. The exposed face of the sandstone glistened. If she laid her palm against it and held it there, her hand came away wet. Not dripping, not flowing, but wet. Tiny beads of water formed on the surface, coalesced, and trickled downward with an almost imperceptible slowness. It was the stone weeping its stored moisture, surrendering it grain by grain to the air and the low-pressure gradient that Agnes had created by opening the rock to the atmosphere. It was a process of infinite patience. But Agnes was a woman who had taught fractions to 9-year-olds for 31 years. Patience was not a virtue she cultivated. It was the bedrock of her character. She engineered the floor of the chamber with the same precision she had applied to the walls. Using her spirit level, she carved a slope of precisely 2 degrees, directing every trickle toward the center, where she excavated a sump pit 5 feet deep and 10 feet wide. This would be the reservoir, the heart of the system. Within a week of completing the chamber, the sump held 6 inches of water. Within 2 weeks, it held a foot. The water was clear and cold, filtered through 80 feet of sandstone, purified by a process so slow and thorough that no surface contaminant could survive it. It tasted of nothing but cleanness. It was the purest water Agnes had ever tasted. Then she began the galleries. There were to be 4 of them radiating from the main chamber like the spokes of a wheel. Each gallery was 2 feet wide, 5 feet high, and 50 feet long. Their purpose was to maximize the surface area of exposed water-bearing rock to create as many weeping walls as possible, each one contributing its slow, steady trickle to the channels that would carry the water back to the central reservoir. This was the most dangerous part of the work. The galleries were narrow. The air was still and heavy. The lantern light created a small island of visibility in a darkness that pressed against her from all sides. She worked on her hands and knees for much of it, the ceiling inches above her head, the walls close enough to touch with both outstretched arms. She had to be meticulous about structural integrity. At regular intervals, she left thick pillars of sandstone standing uncut to support the weight of the rock above. She used her plumb line, constantly checking and rechecking, because a miscalculation of even a few degrees in the floor's slope would mean water pooling in the wrong place, or worse, flowing away from the reservoir instead of toward it. She used her plumb line. She used her spirit level. She used the knowledge that Ezra had given her and the instincts that 50 years of living with the earth had honed. And she advanced, slowly, a few feet each day, each foot of victory measured not in applause but in the quiet, rhythmic dripping of water seeping from the walls and ceiling of the gallery. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of the earth keeping its promise. It was the only companion she had. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to months. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the shaft, the chamber, and the galleries. The sky above was a memory. The town below was a rumor. She existed in a universe of stone and water and flickering lantern light, a solitary figure moving through the belly of the mesa like a miner in a myth, searching not for gold, but for something worth infinitely more. She lost weight. The physical labor and the meager rations carved away everything that was not essential. Her body became lean and hard, a sinew machine adapted to one purpose. Her arms, which had once struggled to swing the pickaxe 10 times without resting, now swung it 50, 100 without pause. Her hands, which had blistered and bled and cracked, were now covered in calluses as thick as boot leather. She saw almost no one. Once a month, she would walk down to the valley after dark to buy supplies from Miller's store with her dwindling funds. She moved through the town like a ghost, her face and clothes stained with the gray of shale dust and the rust red of sandstone grit. People who saw her looked away, unsure whether to pity her or fear her. She spoke to no one about her progress. She carried her secret the way the mesa carried its water. Deep, silent, patient. And up on the anvil, unseen by anyone, the reservoir grew, inch by inch, gallon by gallon, day by day. The stone wept, and Agnes collected its tears, and the water rose in the darkness like a promise being kept in the slowest possible way. By the end of May, the system was nearly complete. 4 galleries, each 50 feet long, radiating from a central chamber that now held over 3,000 gallons of water. The collection rate was steady and reliable, approximately 100 gallons per day, regardless of whether it rained or shone on the surface above. The water came from within the stone itself, from reserves accumulated over centuries, and it would continue to come long after the drought had broken. Agnes stood at the edge of the reservoir in the lantern light and looked at what she had built. It had taken her nearly 6 months. She had spent $42 on materials. She had $5 left. She had excavated a vertical shaft 16 feet deep, a chamber 12 by 16 feet, in 4 galleries totaling 200 feet in length. She had exposed over 2,000 square feet of water-bearing sandstone. She had done it alone with hand tools at the age of 62. The water before her was clear enough to see the chiseled stone bottom. It was cool to the touch. It tasted of nothing but the earth itself, clean and old and patient. She allowed herself one moment of standing in the dark, in the silence, listening to the steady dripping from the four galleries, that quiet musical rhythm. That was the voice of the stone, finally speaking the truth Ezra had always known it held. Then she climbed the ladder. It emerged into the blinding sunlight and began building the capstone. Using the excavated rock, she constructed a small, circular stone house over the mouth of the shaft. It was 10 feet in diameter, with walls 2 feet thick and a heavy, tight-fitting wooden door that she built from juniper planks and sealed with pine pitch. It prevented evaporation. It kept out debris and animals. It secured the only entrance to the water system. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A small, curious stone hut on a barren mesa. The kind of thing a person might glance at and immediately forget. Within it was the gateway to 4,000 gallons of the purest water in the territory. Agnes closed the door and walked it. Then she sat on the stone bench outside the hut, looking out over the valley that was dying below her, and she waited for the world to come to its senses. She would not have to wait long. The Valley of Redemption did not die all at once. It died the way a man dies of thirst. Slowly at first, then, with a terrible accelerating finality that left no room for denial. The fields went first, the crops withering into brittle yellow ghosts that crumbled to dust when the wind touched them. Then the cattle folding to their knees in the empty pastures, their eyes glazed and their tongues swollen, dying with a silence that was worse than any sound. Then the trees along the riverbank, their roots groping blindly through dry soil for water that was no longer there, their leaves curling inward like fists closing around nothing. By early June of 1879, the town of Redemption looked like a place that had been abandoned by God and was in the process of being abandoned by everyone else. A third of the families had already gone. They had loaded their wagons with whatever they could carry and driven away down the valley road, their faces set forward, their eyes refusing to look back at the land that had been in their families for generations. Some went to Denver, some went further. None of them said where they were going because none of them knew. They only knew they could not stay. Those who remained were the stubborn ones, the ones with nowhere else to go, the ones who believed against all evidence that the rain would come, or the river would rise, or some miracle would intervene before the end. They rationed what little water remained. Stagnant ponds, muddy seeps in the lowest parts of the valley floor, water that smelled of rot and tasted of despair, water that had to be strained through cloth before it could be drunk. And even then it left a coating on the tongue that no amount of spitting could remove. The social fabric, which had held together through the early months of the drought with the grim solidarity of shared hardship, was beginning to tear. Disputes erupted over access to the last remaining water sources. Fences were cut, threats were made. A fistfight broke out at the stagnant pond behind the church, two men rolling in the mud over a bucket of water that was not fit for a dog. The children suffered the most, as children always do. Their lips cracked and bled. Their skin grew papery and loose. They stopped playing. They stopped asking questions. They sat in the shade of their porches with the dull, resigned patience of creatures that have learned to expect nothing. Harlan Croft watched his world disintegrate. His ranch, which had once been the largest and most prosperous in the valley, was a skeleton of its former self. The corrals were empty. The bunkhouse was deserted, his ranch hands having drifted away to seek work in places where water still fell from the sky. His fields, which had produced enough hay to feed 300 head of cattle, were bare expanses of cracked earth that looked like the surface of a dead planet. He had sold his cattle for a fraction of their value. He had spent $300 on an engineer who had drilled 106 feet into the ground and found nothing but granite. He had deepened the town well at his own expense, and the town well had gone dry. Every solution he had proposed, every action he had taken, every dollar he had spent had led to the same result: failure. And on the mesa above him, visible from the window of his study, if he cared to look, sat the small stone hut that Agnes Wardwell had built over the mouth of a shaft that led down to water. He had not looked at it in weeks. He could not bear to. The decision was made on the morning of June the 15th, 1879. There was no formal meeting, No gathering in the town hall, no vote. The town hall itself had become a depressing place, its walls still holding the echo of confident declarations that had proven hollow. Instead, the decision happened the way most truly important decisions happen, not through deliberation, but through the exhaustion of every alternative. Croft was sitting on the porch of his ranch house when Peterson came up the road. Then Davies, then the widow Holt leading her two grandchildren by the hand. Then the Miller family, the storekeeper and his wife and their three sons. Then others emerging from their homes and walking toward Croft's ranch with the slow shuffling gait of people who have been beaten by something larger than themselves and have finally stopped pretending otherwise. They gathered in his yard, nearly 30 of them, the majority of Redemption's remaining population. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their faces said everything. The hollowed cheeks, the cracked lips, the eyes that had gone flat with a weariness that was deeper than physical exhaustion. They looked at Croft, and Croft looked at the mesa. He stood up from his chair. It took him a long time. He was 68 years old, and the drought had aged him another 20. His clothes hung on his frame like curtains on a scaffold. His hands, which had once gripped the reins of the valley's destiny with the confidence of a man born to lead, trembled at his sides. "We will go up," he said. That was all. 3 words. But in them was the collapse of everything he had believed about himself and his place in the world. The admission that he had been wrong, that he had led them wrong, that the water they needed, the water that could save them, was in the hands of the woman he had publicly ridiculed and privately tried to dispossess. The procession began. 30 souls, men, women, and children, walking single file up the steep, winding trail to the top of the anvil. The trail that Ezra Wardwell had walked 10,000 times. The trail that Agnes had climbed and descended every day for 6 months, hauling supplies up and rubble down her body, growing harder and leaner with each passage. They walked slowly. They had no choice. Their bodies were weakened by months of dehydration, and the trail was steep, rising 500 feet from the valley floor to the mesa's summit. The sun beat down on them with the mindless, indifferent cruelty that had become the defining feature of their existence. The children had to be carried for the last 100 yards. They reached the top and stopped. The mesa spread before them, flat and barren, and blindingly bright, the same useless expanse of rock that they had dismissed their entire lives. And there, near the mesa's southwestern edge, sat the stone hut. It was small, 10 feet across, roughly built but solid, its walls fitted with the care of someone who understood that this structure was not decorative but functional, not temporary but permanent. It seemed so insignificant against the vast empty sky, a pebble on a table, a footnote on a blank page. How could anything of importance exist inside something so small? The door of the hut opened. Agnes Wardwell stepped out into the sunlight. She was not the woman they remembered from the town hall meeting 6 months ago. That woman had been a grieving widow in a black dress, small and easily dismissed. The woman who stood before them now was something else entirely. She was lean, stripped of every ounce of excess, her body a testament to 6 months of labor that would have broken most men half her age. Her white hair was pulled back tight, her face tanned dark by the sun that found her each morning and evening as she worked on the surface. Her hands, visible at her sides, were mapped with calluses and scars, the hands of a stone cutter, a miner, a builder. But it was her eyes that stopped them. They were clear, calm, unsurprised, as if she had known this day would come, as if she had been waiting for it with the same patience she had brought to every other aspect of this impossible task. She stood in the doorway of the hut and looked at them. Harlan Croft stepped forward. He stopped 10 feet from her. He removed his hat. He held it against his chest with both hands the way a man holds something fragile. He stared at the ground at her feet, unable to meet her eyes. "Mrs. Wardwell," he began, his voice cracked. Not from dryness, though he was parched. From something deeper. From the fracturing of a pride that had been the load-bearing wall of his identity for 68 years. "We were wrong." The words came out slowly, each one extracted from him like a tooth pulled without anesthetic. His jaw worked. His throat convulsed. The veins in his neck stood out like ropes. "Our wells are dry. The river is gone. The engineer found nothing. There is nothing left." He paused. "We are thirsty." Behind him, the others stood in silence. Peterson, who had called her plan the fantasy of a grief-stricken woman. Davies, who had laughed the loudest. Miller, who had sold her the supplies with pity in his eyes. The widow Holt, whose grandchildren clung to her skirts with the quiet, frightened patience of children who have learned that the adults around them are as helpless as they are. Every one of them had been in the town hall that December night. Every one of them had heard Agnes speak and had dismissed her. Every one of them had chosen Croft's plan over hers, had chosen the familiar over the unknown, had chosen the comfortable authority of a powerful man over the quiet conviction of an old woman with a dead husband's journals. Not one of them could meet her eyes now. Agnes looked at their faces. She looked for a long time. She saw the gaunt cheeks of the children, the desperation in the eyes of the women, the broken pride of the men. She saw 6 months of suffering written on their bodies like a text she could read as easily as she read Ezra's journals. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, no vindication, no hint of the words that she had earned the right to speak and chose not to. She had not done this work to prove a point. She had not spent 6 months breaking stone in the dark to win an argument. She had done it because the water was there and the people needed it, and she was the only one who knew how to reach it. "I know," she said softly. "Follow me." She turned and led them to the hut. She opened the heavy juniper door. From the dark opening, a wave of air rose to meet them. Cool air, damp air, air that smelled of wet stone and clean water, and the deep mineral stillness of the earth's interior. The crowd inhaled. It was a collective gasp, involuntary and raw, the sound of 30 people encountering something their bodies recognized before their minds could process it. Moisture, coolness, life. In a world that had been baked dry for months, the scent of water was as shocking as the scent of flowers in a graveyard. "The ladder is strong," Agnes said. "Come down one at a time. Watch your footing." Harlan Croft descended first. The ladder creaked under his weight. Each rung took him deeper into the cool darkness, away from the burning sky, away from the dry, dead world above. The air changed with every step. Warmer at the surface where the sun still reached. Then a transition zone, neutral still. Then cool. Then cold. The kind of cold that comes from deep stone, a cold that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the patient ancient temperature of the earth itself. His boots touched the floor of the main chamber. He stood there, blinking his eyes, struggling to adjust to the lantern light that Agnes had lit before his descent. And what he saw stole the breath from his lungs and the words from his mouth and the last remnants of certainty from his mind. He was standing in a cathedral, not a cathedral of wood and glass and human architecture, but a cathedral carved from living stone. The chamber was 12 feet wide and 16 feet long, its ceiling 7 feet above his head, its walls smooth where Agnes's tools had shaped them, and glistening where the sandstone wept its ancient moisture. The lantern light caught the beads of water on the walls and turned them into 10,000 tiny stars, a constellation of liquid light that shifted and danced with every flicker of the flame. From the chamber, 4 galleries radiated into the darkness like the naves of a cross. He could not see their ends. They disappeared into the stone, into the deep heart of the mesa, and from each one came a sound that was so simple and so profound that it made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Drip, 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 the sound of water falling, steadily, patiently, endlessly. From every surface of every wall and ceiling of every gallery, water seeped and gathered and trickled downward, following the channels Agnes had carved into the floor, flowing toward the center of the chamber, where the reservoir waited. And the reservoir. Croft walked to its edge and looked down. The sump was 5 feet deep and 10 feet wide, and it held over 4 feet of water. He could see the bottom. Every chisel mark, every groove where Agnes's tools had shaped the stone. The water was so clear, so absolutely free of sediment and color, that it seemed to not be there at all, a window of pure transparency set into the floor of the earth. He knelt. The great Harlan Croft, the man who had ruled the valley with his wealth and his will, and his unshakable conviction that he understood the world better than anyone else in it. He knelt on the stone floor of a chamber carved by a 62-year-old widow with a pickaxe and a set of iron wedges, and he cupped his hands and he lowered them into the water. It was cold, clean. It tasted of nothing but the stone itself, ancient and pure, filtered through 80 feet of sandstone, Over centuries, every impurity stripped away by the slow, meticulous process of time. He drank, and something inside him, something that had been holding itself rigid for 68 years, quietly broke. One by one the others descended. Each one gasped. Each one stood in the chamber with the same expression of bewildered awe, their heads turning slowly as they took in the scale of what one woman had created. The smooth walls, the radiating galleries, the sound of water, that beautiful, rhythmic, impossible sound echoing from every direction. They approached the reservoir with a reverence that none of them would have been able to explain. It was water. That was all. Just water. The same substance that had flowed through their valley for generations without inspiring a moment's wonder. But here in this underground chamber, access through 16 feet of solid rock found in a place that every one of them had declared worthless, the water was transformed. It was not just water, it was proof. Proof that the world held secrets they had been too proud and too certain to look for. A woman knelt at the edge of the sump. She cupped her hands and brought the water to her lips and wept. Her tears fell into the reservoir and joined the water there, a human offering to an ancient store. The children drank with their faces close to the surface, their small hands gripping the stone edge, their eyes wide with the particular joy of children who have been given something they had stopped hoping for. The water ran down their chins and soaked the fronts of their shirts, and not one of them cared. For several minutes, the only sounds in the chamber were the dripping of water from the gallery walls and the quiet, desperate sounds of people drinking. Then they turned to Agnes. She stood at the base of the ladder, her back against the rough stone wall, her arms folded across her chest. The lantern light caught the sharp angles of her face, the white of her hair, the deep lines that 6 months of solitary labor had carved around her eyes and mouth. She looked in that moment like something more than a woman. She looked like the mesa itself, patient, enduring, carved by time into something essential. "How?" Croft whispered. His voice was hoarse, not from thirst, but from the weight of what he was feeling. Awe, shame, gratitude, each one enormous, and all three pressing against each other inside his chest, like stones in a wall that was about to give way. "How did you do this alone?" Agnes looked at him. She looked at all of them. "I was not alone," she said. The words hung in the cool, damp air. Several people looked around as if expecting to see someone else in the chamber, a hidden crew of workers who had aided her in secret. "I had my husband's knowledge," she said. 40 years of his life's work written in his journals, mapped on his charts. "I had a good pickaxe, I had a strong rope, and I had the certainty that the rock would provide if it was asked correctly." She paused. Her voice, when she continued, carried the quiet authority of a teacher delivering the most important lesson of her career. The earth is not an adversary to be conquered with deeper drills and bigger machines. It is a partner to be understood. Ezra knew that. He spent his life learning the language of this stone, and when I listened to what he had learned, the stone answered. She let the silence hold. "You tried to solve the drought with force," she said, "with money, with a 100-foot drill and $300 worth of equipment, and you hit granite because you were asking the wrong question in the wrong place. The water was never down there, it was up here. It was always up here. You just never thought to look." No one spoke. No one could. They ascended back into the sunlight like people emerging from a dream. The brightness staggered them. The heat was a physical assault after the cool sanctuary below. But something had shifted. The despair that had settled over them like a burial shroud had been replaced by something fragile but real. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for what they felt. It was closer to knowledge. The certain tangible knowledge that the water existed, that it was real, that it was enough. Croft stood before Agnes. The others gathered behind him in a loose semicircle, their faces still wet, their eyes still carrying the reflected light of the underground reservoir. "We will pay you," Croft said. His voice was different now. The authority was gone. The condescension was gone. What remained was something raw and unguarded, the voice of a man who has been stripped of his pretensions and has not yet figured out who he is without them. "Whatever price you ask for the water, name it, whatever you want." Agnes looked out over the valley. From the mesa's edge, she could see all of it. The brown dead fields, the empty corrals, the abandoned homesteads with their doors hanging open, like the mouths of the surprised dead. The dry riverbed a white scar across the landscape. All of it ruined, all of it lost. Not to the drought alone, but to the pride and stubbornness that had refused to listen when listening might have saved everything. She thought of Ezra, of the decades he had spent studying this mesa, mapping its secrets, trying to share what he had found with men who would not hear him. She thought of the town hall meeting, of Croft's laughter, of Peterson's scorn. She thought of the 6 months she had spent in the dark alone, her body breaking and remaking itself against the stone. Money was an insult to all of it. "The water is not for sale," she said. Her voice carried across the mesa with a clarity that silenced the wind itself. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a woman who had earned through suffering and labor and an unshakable faith in the truth the right to dictate terms. "It is for sharing," she said, "but there will be conditions." She turned to face them fully. Every face, every pair of eyes. "We will establish a rationing system, a fair one, based on need, not on wealth, not on the size of your ranch or the number of your cattle. Every family will receive what it needs to survive. No more, no less. A council will be formed to oversee the distribution, and I will lead it." She paused, letting each word land like a stone dropped into still water. "And you will learn." The word surprised them. They had expected demands, prices, conditions of payment, but learn was something else entirely. "You will all learn the principles of this system," Agnes continued. "You will learn to read the land, to understand the geology beneath your feet, to respect the water and maintain what has been built here. Every man, every woman, every child old enough to hold a book will attend the lessons I will give. The knowledge that my husband spent his life accumulating and that you spent your lives ignoring will not be forgotten again. That is my price." There was a long silence. Harlan Croft looked at the ground. He looked at the stone hut. He looked at Agnes Wardwell, this woman he had tried to buy out for $50, this woman he had threatened with seizure of her land, this woman whose judgment he had dismissed as the confusion of grief and old age. "Agreed," he said. It was the smallest word he had ever spoken, and it cost him more than anything he had ever paid. The others nodded, murmured, "Agreed." There were no arguments. There was no negotiation. There was only the humble, unanimous acceptance of terms that were not harsh, but were absolute. In the days that followed, a second figure came to the mesa. Garrett Loomis had not left Redemption after all. He had stayed in the valley, sleeping in his wagon, outside the abandoned livery stable, unable to bring himself to leave. He was a man trained in the science of water extraction, and he had failed. His drill had struck granite. His instruments had told him there was nothing here. And yet on the mesa above him, a 62-year-old woman with hand tools had found what his machinery could not. It gnawed at him. Not his pride, though, that was wounded, something deeper, his curiosity, his identity as an engineer, as a man who believed in the rational investigation of the natural world. He could not leave without understanding how she had done it. He climbed the trail on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the town had surrendered. He found Agnes at the mouth of the shaft, sitting on the stone bench outside the hut, reading one of Ezra's journals in the early light. "Mrs. Wardwell," he said. He held his hat in his hands. "I am Garrett Loomis. I was the man Judge Croft hired to drill his well." "I know who you are," Agnes said with Garrett looking up. "I failed," he said. "I drilled 106 feet into the valley floor and found nothing but granite." "You drilled in the wrong place," Agnes said, "and you drilled in the wrong direction." Loomis was quiet for a moment. "May I see it?" Agnes closed the journal. She looked at him. She studied his face the way she had once studied the faces of her students, reading what was written there, sorting the genuine from the performed. What she saw was not arrogance. It was not the dismissive confidence that had characterized every other man who had spoken to her about water. What she saw was humility, the real kind, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from the honest recognition that you have encountered something beyond your understanding and you want to learn. "Come," she said. She led him down the ladder and through the chamber and into the galleries. Loomis walked in silence, his hands trailing along the damp walls, his engineer's mind cataloging everything it encountered. The precise slope of the floor, the calculated placement of the support pillars, the elegant simplicity of the collection channels, the staggering volume of water in the central reservoir. When they emerged back into the sunlight, Loomis stood at the edge of the mesa and looked out over the valley for a long time. "This is the most remarkable feat of hydraulic engineering I have ever seen," he said. His voice was quiet and carried no flattery. It was the voice of a professional rendering an honest assessment. "The Connaught system. I studied it in school. Read about it in textbooks. I never imagined I would see one built in the American West. And I never imagined it would be built by one person." "It was built by two people," Agnes said. "My husband mapped it. I dug it." Loomis turned to her. "I would like to stay," he said. "I would like to learn. I would like to understand the geology of this mesa the way your husband understood it. And then I would like to teach it to others, so that what you have done here does not exist in only one place in one mind." Agnes looked at him. She looked at the valley below. She thought of Ezra, who had spent 40 years trying to share his knowledge and had been ignored. She thought of the journal's 37 volumes of meticulous observation and calculation, the work of a lifetime, sitting in a cabin on a mesa that the world had called worthless. Knowledge dies when it is hoarded. It lives when it is given away. "There is one condition," she said. "Name it. You do not teach only engineers. You teach everyone, farmers, ranchers, women, children. The knowledge belongs to the land, and the land belongs to everyone who lives on it." Loomis nodded. "Agreed." It was Agnes reflected a much easier agreement than the one Harlan Croft had made. But then Loomis had less to lose. He had already lost his certainty. All he had left was the willingness to start again, which is the only thing a person truly needs. In the months that followed, the anvil became the heart of redemption. A pipeline was constructed from the mesa to the town. It was made of hollowed-out logs sealed at the joints with pine pitch, and it carried a controlled, steady flow of water down the slope to a distribution point in the center of town. The system was primitive by any urban standard, but it worked. It worked because it was built on the same principles Agnes had used in her galleries: gravity slope and the patient cooperation of natural forces. Agnes taught. She held her lessons at the mouth of the shaft, sitting on the stone bench with Ezra's journals open on her lap. His maps spread on the flat rock beside her. The men who had once laughed at her now sat before her on the ground, their hats in their hands, listening with the focused attention of students who understand for the first time that what they are learning might save their lives. She taught them the geology of the mesa, the layers of limestone and shale and sandstone, each one a chapter in a story written over millions of years. She taught them about porosity and permeability, about how water moves through stone, about the difference between an aquifer and a well. She taught them about the Connaught system, about its origins in the ancient deserts of the Old World, about how it had sustained civilizations for thousands of years, in places where rain was a memory and rivers were myths. She taught them to read the land, not the way they had always read it, looking at the surface for signs of green, for the glint of water, for the obvious markers of fertility. She taught them to read what was beneath, to understand that the most important part of the landscape was the part they could not see, that the earth held its greatest treasures not on its skin but in its bones. Garrett Loomis assisted her. He translated her geological language into the practical terms that farmers and ranchers understood. He drew diagrams, he built models. He took the knowledge that Ezra had accumulated over a lifetime and that Agnes had proven with her hands, and he began the work of making it portable, transferable, permanent. Ruth Croft came to the lessons too. She sat in the back, quiet as always, her hands folded in her lap. She never spoke. She never asked questions. But she listened with an intensity that Agnes recognized, the intensity of a mind that has been waiting a long time for permission to learn. After the third lesson, Agnes asked Ruth to stay behind. "You have been leaving baskets at the base of the trail," Agnes said. It was not a question. Ruth looked at her hands. She said nothing. "The bread kept me alive," Agnes said. "The salve kept my hands from cracking open. You should know that." Ruth looked up. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been relief. "I could not come up," she whispered. "He would have known." "I know," Agnes said. "You helped in the way that was available to you. That is enough. That is always enough." She placed her hand over Ruth's. The old woman's hand, scarred and calloused and hard as the stone she had shaped, covering the younger woman's soft palm. "I would like you to help me with the council," Agnes said. "There is work to be done, and I cannot do it alone, not anymore. Ruth Croft, who had spent her married life in the shadow of a man who believed that strength was measured in volume and women were measured in silence, looked at Agnes Wardwell and said the word that changed the direction of her life. Yes, the great drought of 1879 lasted for another full year. The rains did not return until the spring of 1880, and when they came slowly, hesitantly, as if the sky itself was unsure whether the land deserved them. But by then it did not matter. Redemption had survived. Not comfortably, not without sacrifice, but survived. The water from the anvil flowed steadily through the log pipeline 100 gallons a day, every day regardless of the weather. It was rationed carefully, distributed fairly, and treated with a respect that bordered on reverence. No one wasted a drop. No one took more than their share. The council that Agnes led met weekly, and its decisions were followed without complaint because every person in the valley understood in a way they could never unlearn what the absence of water meant. The town that emerged from the drought was not the same town that had entered it. It was smaller, leaner, scarred, but it was also wiser in the way that only suffering can make a community wise. The old certainties were gone. The belief that the valley's prosperity was guaranteed by the river, by the soil, by the sheer momentum of tradition, had been burned out of them as thoroughly as the drought had burned their fields. In its place was something harder and more durable, an understanding that the land was not a given, but a gift, that water was not a right, but a responsibility. That knowledge, the patient, unglamorous, often ridiculed work of understanding the world beneath your feet, was the most valuable thing a community could possess. Harlan Croft lived for another 7 years. He never fully recovered his former standing, nor did he seek to. The drought had broken something in him that could not be repaired, but it had also in the breaking released something that had been trapped inside him for a long time, a capacity for humility that his pride had never permitted. He attended every one of Agnes's lessons. He sat in the front row. He took notes in a leather-bound journal that he had purchased for the purpose. He never interrupted. He never questioned. He simply listened with the attention of a man who has learned at great cost that listening is the beginning of wisdom. He never apologized to Agnes directly. He did not have the words for it. But one afternoon, as the lesson ended and the others filed away, he remained seated. Agnes looked at him. Ezra was right, he said quietly, about all of it. Yes, Agnes said, he was. I should have listened. Yes. There was nothing else to say. And in the absence of words, something was communicated that words could not have carried. An acknowledgement, silent and complete, that the world is full of truths that powerful men refuse to hear, and that the cost of that refusal is always paid by someone else. Agnes Wardwell lived to be 81 years old, but she never left the anvil. She lived in the small stone cabin that Ezra had built, surrounded by his journals, his maps, his samples of rock. She taught until her voice grew too thin to carry, and then she wrote. She compiled Ezra's 40 years of research into a single comprehensive volume, which Garrett Loomis arranged to have printed by a publisher in Denver. It was titled simply The Language of Stone, and it was dedicated to Ezra Wardwell, who listened to the rock when no one else would. The book was not a bestseller. It was not reviewed in the Eastern papers. It did not make Agnes rich or famous. But it found its way, as useful things do, into the hands of people who needed it. Engineers in arid territories, farmers on the high plains, men and women who looked at dry, unpromising land and wondered whether it might hold secrets that the surface did not reveal. On the last page, Agnes had written a single paragraph that served as both an epilogue and a credo. The most profound strength, she wrote, often comes from the most overlooked places, a mesa of worthless rock, a widow's stubborn hands, a dead man's journals. The world is not short of water or wisdom or solutions. It is short of the patience to look for them in places that do not at first glance seem worth the looking. She died on a spring morning in 1897 in the stone cabin on the mesa with the sound of water dripping in the galleries below her. The sound that had been her companion for 18 years. The sound of the earth keeping its oldest promise. They buried her next to Ezra on the eastern edge of the anvil, where the morning sun struck first and the view of the valley was unobstructed. The headstone was simple. It bore their names, their dates, in a single line that Agnes had chosen herself. The stone answered, Below them in the cool darkness, the water continued to flow. It seeped from the sandstone walls. It trickled along the channels. It gathered in the reservoir that one woman had carved from solid rock, with nothing but hand tools, in the certainty that the earth would provide if it was asked correctly. It flows there still.